Hello everyone, welcome to the official kick-off event of Cross Challenge. My name is Tobias Reichert and I'm musicologist and researcher at the University of Music and Theater Munich. And on behalf of my colleagues, I want to welcome everyone who joined us here in the Tiersch Tower of the Technical University of Munich and online. I especially want to welcome the speakers of today's evening, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg and Paolo Tavares, and of course our students who will participate in the very first edition of Cross Challenge. My colleagues and I, that is Peter Finger from the Young Academy of the Technical University of Munich, Susanne Witzkal from the Academy of Fine Arts Munich, and Daniel Lang from the University of Television and Film Munich, are excited that after months of discussion, organizing and planning, and frankly some uncertainties caused by this thing called pandemic, we are now finally able to launch this special program hosted by our 4 universities for the first time. With Cross Challenge, we want to promote transdisciplinary research early on and encourage the collaboration between scientists and artists, because we believe in the innovation and transformative potential. Students from our universities are invited to form small transdisciplinary teams and to develop a project of their own choice that will be inspired by a guiding topic about which we will hear more in just a minute. All teams will receive a small production budget, input from international experts, and will be supported by lecturers of the 4 partner institutions. The program will run for 4 months, after which all teams will present their projects on 25th of February. So in case you're interested, stay tuned for more. Before we get started, a few remarks. For everybody here in the room, we are in the clock tower of the Technical University, so if you hear a rumbling noise above your head, that's the bell that will ring every quarter of an hour. So don't be afraid. After my introduction, Susanne will tell you a bit more about this year's guiding topic, caring coexistence. After that, Daniel will introduce the speakers of today's evening, the artist and designer Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg and the architect and urbanist Paolo Tavares, who will then give a presentation of 45 minutes each. We will then enter a short panel discussion and a Q&A session. All online participants can use the chat function. We will moderate the discussion and try to take into account all questions. The evening will end approximately at 8 o'clock our time. And with that, I'll hand over to Susanne, however, not without welcoming everybody once again and wishing us a wonderful and inspiring evening. Thanks.
So thank you, Tobias, and also warm welcome from my side from the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. And yeah, as Tobias already said, the overarching theme of Cross Challenge Part 1, developed after a brainstorming session with some of our students, is, as already mentioned, caring coexistence. And this is also the topic for tonight's panel, inaugurating this new collaborative format. And against the backdrop of our several ecological crises, and I'm not only talking about climate change, but also plastic pollution, soil degradation, species extinction, human-wildlife conflicts, and so forth, it is widely recognized today that we have to think and implement new ways of relating to the more than human world and of living together. Caring coexistence poses a complex question how we can imagine, how we can foster and perhaps realize multi-species coexistence in the face of capitalist ruins and a damaged planet. In other words, how we can nurture ecological modes of existence that are worth striving for. As you might already have noticed, however, the title Caring Coexistence doesn't simply pose the central question. It rather already carries affirmative implications, which I want to elaborate a bit on in my short introduction. First of all, the term coexistence suggests that we as humans don't come into being as isolated, exclusive entities and exist more or less autonomous, but that we live and thrive with human and non-human others in company. We are enmeshed into complex and dynamic relations of a multitude of diverse living and non-living actors on which our life depends. Indigenous peoples, their knowledge systems and legal political realities have acknowledged this fact for millennia, as though Todd and others already highlighted. But Euro-Western people, we in the so-called global North, seem to have forgotten or deliberately ignored this for far too long. Especially over the past 3 decades, however, Western discourses like new materialism, post-humanism, techno or ecofeminism, and interdisciplines such as material eco-criticism, eco-materialism, or ecological humanities are eagerly working on the at least conceptual relocation of the human in a wider web of connections with non-humans, and humans, of course. They work on a non-modernist relational ontology, an ontology of becoming with. Furthermore, scholars like Don Haraway or Karen Barrett derive from this relational ontology an ethical practice, which they link with the ability to respond, with responsibility. Haraway's responsibility towards and with our fellow beings can be understood as a reconceptualized and relational version of responsibility that is in turn and I quote Haraway, a relationship, as she explains in When Species Meet, crafted in interaction through which entities, subjects, and objects come into being, end quote. The physicist and feminist theorist Karen Barrett further sharpens such ideas and describes responsibility as something that the individual cannot evade, but is an ethical obligation anchored in the relational entanglements of being. I quote, responsibility is not an obligation that the subject chooses, she explains, but rather an incarnate relation that precedes the intentionality of consciousness, end quote. Since we are bodies of belonging that only came into being due to immanent relations and co-constitute the becoming of the other in an ongoing process of affecting and being affected, we are indebted to, we are responsible for the other. In short, we have to care. And here we have the second term of our headline. Care, however, is no innocent notion referring to a harmonious domain, but is rather entangled in structures of inequality and games of power. Think of the underpaid work of professional caregivers or the undervalued work of those staying at home and taking care of the household and the children, still mostly women. In addition, care is the premise of a neoliberal governance, as Maria Puig de la Bella Casa reminds us, among others, a governance demanding first and foremost caring for ourselves, our lifestyles, our bodies, especially for our physical and mental fitness, which is important for maintaining our neoliberal capitalist system. To care for someone other or for somewhat might have in turn paternalistic connotations in the sense, since I'm more powerful than you, I care for you. In contrast to this concept of care by Haraway, Puig de la Bella Casa, Barrett, or other techno or ecofeminist thinkers, which we are referring to with the wording caring coexistence, caring is more caring for and a caring with, an affective orientation and attunement to the other, and a caring in non-exceptionalist, non-paternalistic ways, operating from within the networked interdependencies of the living and the non-living. It is a caring in which we are, according to Puig de la Bella Casa, entangled with the recipients of our care, and that makes us realize that that or whom we care for somehow owns us, We belong to it through the care that has attached us. So far from my side, and I'm sure that we learn more how such a caring coexistence might be achieved or might look like from our wonderful guests of tonight, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg and Paolo Tavares. And before I hand over to Daniel Lang from the University of Film and Television, who will introduce Daisy and Paolo, I would like to thank also every partner institutions, the Junge Akademie of the Technical University Munich, the University of Film and Television, and the University for Music and Theater for this wonderful cooperation. And a very special thanks is due to Peter Finger from the TUMJA, from the Technical University, who made this all possible and is hosting us tonight in this extraordinary location. Peter, thank you. Okay, Daniel.
Hello, my name's Daniel Lang. I'm from the HFF, the University of TV and Film in Munich. I'm very happy to be here, but I'm even happier to introduce our guests, speakers today. I guess if the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's that we're going more digital, and it's a good thing in a way. Of course, it would be nice to have you here in person, but yeah, now we have you on our screens. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg is an artist who examines our relationship, our difficult relationship with nature and technology. And for example, her work Growth Assembly examines the concept of synthetic biology and dreams about growing consumer products or consumer goods. The work The Substitute tackles extinction and contrasts it with the creation of an AI that mimics the extinction of a northern rhino. And in The Wilding of Mars, this work imagines the colonization of Mars by plant life. She exhibits internationally, for example, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, the Centre Pompidou, and the Royal Academy. Paolo Taveras, on the other hand, is an architect, writer, and educator. Taveras said urbanist, which I quite liked as well. His works include the work Non-Human Rights, which looks at the Constitution of Ecuador that grants fundamental human rights to rocks, mountains, and the sea, etc., in looking at them in an animist type of way. And I think it's an older work, but I think that New Zealand has incorporated it in its constitution now as well. Another work of his, An Architectural Botany, examines parts of the Amazon forest and suggests that what we see as a natural forest, natural in quotes, is in fact shaped by humans, which I found really interesting. He currently teaches spatial and visual cultures at the University of Brasilia in Brazil, and leads the architectural agency Autonoma, a platform dedicated to urban research and intervention. And I'll give the word now, the mic, to Alexandra.
It's so great to be with you as a floating head, and I'm sorry not to be with you, but it's true. It is much easier to talk about the climate emergency by not flying to talk about it. So we win and we lose. So I'm just going to share my screen and start talking. So you can see that. Okay, I just want to check. Is that good? Yeah. So I'm going to share with you 3 recent works, and I think the context, I'm really excited to hear Paolo's talk as well, to hear how these 2 different practices overlap. And I think also it just made me think with this introduction, how all of these works are actually about not being in the place where the subject of the work happens. So I want to take us first to Mars and this barren, treacherous landscape. And this is a place that we have never been, but we're becoming increasingly familiar with this kind of representation of this sublime landscape, an empty frontier. But of course, Mars might not be an empty frontier, and it isn't, because it is an entity in itself. And we don't know if there are life forms or if there ever have been life forms there. But the way Mars is being talked about, and this isn't a new way of thinking, is this planet B, a place that we can transform into a new Earth and settle, so we'll terraform it. And this is a very popular cultural trope talking about this planet, that we're going to colonize it, and that's okay. And with it comes this transformation into a new Earth. And the reason is because we're doing the opposite to our own planet. And so all our problems can be solved. We don't have to change our behaviors. We can just do this. Now, this isn't actually a new concern. In the 19th century, Percival Lowell, who was an amateur astronomer, was reading the works of an Italian astronomer called Schiaparelli, who had identified these channels on Mars, and he called them canali. And Lowell purposefully sort of misinterpreted this as channels, and he saw them as the evidence of man-made or alien civilizations that had now disappeared, probably due to climate change. And around him on Earth, he was seeing the signs of the sort of terrible effects of colonial sort of encroachment and industrialization on the natural environment. So it was already an early sort of warning sign. And as he described it, Earth was going the way of Mars. Now, I was asked in 2017 or 18, gosh, the time has, in the olden days before the pandemic, to create a new work for this exhibition at the Design Museum in London. And the show was about the colonization of Mars. And colonization is an incredibly problematic and violent term that has an extreme history attached to it and an ongoing sort of present. And what's so extraordinary is this whole rhetoric around Mars is about colonization as a good thing, and this idea that design is going to be part of this and is a force for good alongside colonization, I find deeply problematic. So I suggested that instead I would make something critical, and the curator said, well, that's fine as long as it's optimistic, because it's a family show. And I thought this was the most inspiring brief to try and meet. And so I proposed this work called The Wilding of Mars. And the idea was to talk about colonization, but use the act of colonizing as a way to reflect on it as a practice. And the entire work is based on this idea of humans not going to Mars and only sending plants as our pioneers, and seeing Mars as a repository for life, as a place for life to go and turn Mars into its own world, and Mars to turn these plants into take a new direction in evolution. So this was the concept, was to wild Mars in a simulation. And it turned out to be a very difficult thing to do. So to build an ecological simulation that could run for 1 million years to show the slowness of geological and biological time and evolutionary time compared to the way we are behaving here on Earth. And I say we in a very general way, because of course, it's not all of us who are so involved in such destructive behaviors. I certainly am, but not all humans are equally responsible. But to build the simulation, we had to start somewhere. So the idea began with having to select our pioneers. And again, I use this colonial language purposefully as a way to highlight and reflect on it. But when you want to choose plants that could go to Mars, it turns out to be quite difficult. So I started talking to scientists at NASA and planetary geoscientists and historians of science, and trying to work out which plants could actually survive in these terrible conditions on Mars, where the air is like, the sand is like needles, and the air is like dry cleaning fluid, and it's about -40 degrees. So we began by choosing a number of extremophiles, so organisms that can survive in the most extreme locations on Earth. So these are all real Earth life forms. And the idea was that these pioneers would be sent to settle. And there's no time frame when this is happening. There's no indication of who's doing it. But to build the simulation, we needed to know about each of these organisms. So we looked at where they survive on Earth and the kinds of environments they can tolerate. We had to collapse nutrients into sort of atmospheric and ground-based nutrients to look at how extreme the environments they could survive in. And then we started to think about, well, where would they go? So the first pioneers would end up on the South Pole, as what our friend at NASA suggested, as a way to begin to create some kind of atmosphere. Then we could send more pioneers who would then start to colonize the planet over 500,000 years. So this is the southern pole of Mars from the simulation, and the polar ice cap there, which is made out of carbon dioxide and water ice, is melted in this case by a form of cyanobacteria, which is called, its common name is watermelon snow. And you may have seen images of glaciers that have gone pink as this organism takes over. And it causes the snow to melt by increasing the absorption of UV to warm the snow. So our ice cap would start to melt and start to release water into the atmosphere and start to sort of create this metabolism process of producing an environment. And within there, we start to see some of these pioneers sort of creeping across the landscape. You'll notice at the bottom, there is, I hope you can see it on the screen, there's a sort of title bar running along the bottom. And I wanted it to be like a webcam, to use these tropes that we're familiar with to kind of tell us that this is a thing that we can only observe. So this is the year 640,000. We know the latitude and longitude. The temperature is now 8 degrees. The water level's at 10%, and nutrients have increased up to 8% from where they were before. This is in the year 573,000, and we start to see a meadow encroaching. And on the bottom, you can see the population number, which is the number of different organisms within the simulation, has reached 23,500. 55 new species have evolved, and of those, 19 have gone extinct. We end up 300,000 years later. Oh, sorry, I just skipped one. 300,000 years later, and the meadow has started to sort of really take hold. Now, it was really important to me to think about not creating I didn't want to create a utopia. The aim of this work is really to reflect back on Earth. And a way to think about that is as a heterotopia, which is a term coined by the philosopher Foucault. And he talks about the heterotopia as a place that's not better or worse, but it's different. And the reason to think about these kinds of environments is they become a space where we can reflect back on. So the wilding of Mars is another world to reflect back on our behaviors on Earth. And as a way of sort of exploring that, I want this work to always be shown as 2 simultaneous simulations as a minimum. So here you see, if I just play these again, the same scene running at the same time, but totally different environmental conditions are emerging. And this is a way for evolution to happen within the simulation and to take different directions. And what starts to happen is you start to look at one and then the other, and you're like, which one do I prefer? And it starts to create value judgments. And this is an innately human way of behaving. It's like, is this one better, or do I prefer this one? So the work is shown in this format with these 2 parallel worlds as sets of sort of webcam views. And this is it currently on show. It just opened in Rome at the Pala Expo exhibition. And it runs for an hour, and 1 million years sort of passes over that time. And within the setup, there's actually 2 sets of screens. You've got this plant cam, which is showing plants growing and new species evolving at their own speed. So we look at plants and we don't see movement, but actually, if you look at a sort of stop motion video of a plant growing, you start to see it moving around and finding the light. And so I use those similar speeds in the work so that we feel alienated. This is not happening on our time. And on the wall on the left, what you see are sort of botanical records of plants that have been sampled from the simulation, showing this process of evolution. And I'm really interested, and you'll see throughout this talk, how I use these modes of representation from Western science, from Western history of art, ways of looking at landscape, ways of structuring the world, as a lens to reflect back on it, on this structuring model that we're so familiar with and so become embedded within. So these are three of our pioneers, and over time they start to become stranger and stranger and take new forms. What you'll see along the bottom as well is the naming. So I had to talk to some philosophers of biology because I was really stuck what to call these descendants of the pioneers. And they said, well, you can call them whatever you want because they don't exist, which is a very good answer from a philosopher. But also that, there was this kind of fundamental question: how do you fit things in this traditional naming model that Western science has evolved, the Linnaean system, where plants have two, a first name and a second name, essentially. And I decided that we'd add a third name, so Marcia, to indicate that this was a new species off planet. So we needed its own new naming system. But to recognize that they were somehow different, they're named using a barcoding system as their subspecies. So they all start to come together in these enormous panels and enormous sort of new records. And this is another way of thinking about how in the last few hundred years, botanists and so plant finders have traveled around the world and collected things that don't belong to them and formed collections as a way of making sense of the world. So I wanted to use that same model as a way of just sort of highlighting how crazy human behavior is, that we have to name something to kind of know it. And this work, in a way, just creates this window, this sort of sublime visual painting that we can't actually explore. And one of the driving forces behind my practice is this curiosity about the practice of design. So I was introduced as an artist and designer, and I originally trained in architecture and then sort of moved towards a different kind of practice. And I spent 10 years hanging out with synthetic biologists who are kind of genetic engineer, but sort of more so. So what I discovered around 2008 were that there were these engineers coming into biology, and whereas traditionally for the last 30 years, biologists had been doing genetic engineering, sort of taking a gene from somewhere and trying it out in something else to see what would happen. These engineers and computer scientists were coming in and saying, well, we need to do this completely differently. Let's take the rules instead from engineering and try and make DNA into a programming code. And the whole point of this is we can make biology easier to engineer, and then we can make the world better by doing this. And at the same time, I was attending design conferences and was sort of involved in design scene, but from a more critical perspective. And everyone in the design and technology scene is promising that what they do is going to make the world a better place. And I began to wonder, what is better? What does that actually mean? And in a way, this is a form of solutionism. And this term is coined by the technology critic Evgeny Morozov. And he talks about solutionism as a very sort of current way of thinking, which is, well, we'll use technology or design to solve a problem, and then we can just make it better. And instead, what it does is it doesn't actually address the problem underneath. It doesn't acknowledge that the world is full of friction and some problems can't be solved. And one of them, of course, being perhaps like something like climate change. We say, oh, we'll make more technology and it'll be fine. A really nice example I find this is the Ring doorbell made by Amazon. So you have this doorbell, you can watch if someone's going to steal your parcels, but it doesn't address the problem of why people are stealing your parcels. So it doesn't address the kind of social structures underneath. Now, I want to return, though, to sort of what my practice is really steered towards, is this question of different kinds of value systems. So, especially in the run up to COP and the climate conference at the moment, we're all sort of focusing on, can we make nature better? And at the same time, you've got to ask, well, what does better mean in the context of nature? Is this even something that makes sense? Whenever I hear this word better, I end up sort of focusing back on these three questions. And I wrote my PhD about this problem. Is, well, when you start to say, well, and everyone's saying, I'm going to make the world better. Well, what is better? Whose better is being delivered? And crucially, who gets to decide? So if we come back to this question of what's better for nature, this whole sort of thing starts to unravel a bit. So we can go all the way back to, well, what is nature and where do we say it starts? And this idea of the Garden of Eden, this perfect place where humanity was part of the natural world. And then, of course, we took a different path. But then the solution is, well, we need to either reintegrate ourselves or remove ourselves from the natural world, but to make nature better. But that doesn't really address the fundamental problem here, which is that better is a human idea. It's a way that we think about the world, because perhaps we're the only species that can really imagine, and that's, that we can think about the future, we can anticipate something that is better. It's what motivates us. We are a hopeful animal. So, for example, this lovely peacock didn't decide that it was going to grow this magnificent tail to attract mates. Adaptation and context are the reason that it has this tail. A giraffe doesn't choose to grow a longer neck to be able to reach those leaves at the top of the tree. It's better is, if we can describe it as that in the natural world, is really just a reaction by DNA and random mutation to context. And it's about the survival across the species, not across individuals, and not through choice. So better is a really strange thing to apply to the natural world. Making a landscape better means that you could think about it only in human-centric terms, that somehow there's a starting state and an end state, and we get to decide what that end state should be. So this idea has human measures, but it's still a useful way, I think, to think about the world. There is no one better, as that Mars simulation shows. There's just two different ways the world could be. But we can take this from an anthropocentric point of view. We can say, well, what's better for nature is better for us. And this is kind of the working model that we need to go by, because there's no other way for humans that seems to be able to imagine changing our behaviors. So I see the way sort of around us increasingly that, I've talked about this sort of the innate ability of humans to imagine, but what we're really experiencing is a crisis of imagination. How do we imagine better? How do we actually act differently? And what kinds of actions should we take? So I'm going to show a second project, which began in 2019. And this is a collaboration with the creative director of a biotech company. So Christina Agapakis has a very unusual job. Biotech companies haven't traditionally had creative directors. And Ginkgo is now a very large biotech company in the US that does synthetic biology. It engineers organisms like yeast and bacteria to produce molecules such as medicine, sort of chemical components of medicines or fragrances, things that are useful to us. So they're in the business of exploiting life to make stuff for us. And Cecil Tolas is a smell researcher and artist. So her whole practice is around the creation of smells to make us think. She says that the world, there's no such thing as a bad smell. There's only interesting ones. And this piece began in 2014 when Christina went to the herbarium at Harvard University. And she had got interested in starting a research project within Ginkgo where they would try and reconstruct the smells of extinct flowers. And the reason to do this is, if you're from a commercial perspective, is that perhaps there's some interesting new molecules that could be discovered and reproduced. But also from a research perspective, it's just super interesting. Is it possible? Is this the first step to Jurassic Park? Which is something they're very interested in at Ginkgo as a sort of in-house joke. So Christina went to the herbarium and she started to scour the racks of pressed flower specimens, and she found a number of things. She had the IUCN Modern Extinction List with her and started to see if anything on this list was in the archives. And she found about 20 plants, and we ended up working with 3 of them, these 3. So on the left is the Hibiscadelphus Wilderianis, which grew on Maui in Hawaii, and it grew on the side of a volcano. And it was last seen in about 1912 when the last tree was found dead. And this tree went extinct because of colonial cattle ranching. So the lava forests on the side of Mount Haleakala had been completely sort of raised by cattle and through this farming process. The second flower in the middle is the Urbexillum stipulatum. It was a kind of scurf pea, and it grew on a single island in the Ohio River, an island called Rock Island, and it was last seen in 1881, and they tried to cultivate it and it was impossible. And that island itself disappeared in the 1920s when a huge US engineering project dam flooded the basin and the island was submerged. So its habitat was completely lost. And the third flower on the right is the Leucadendron Grandiflorum, a kind of protea from Cape Town. And this plant was last seen in London in 1805 in a collector's garden who had an extensive collection of plants that he'd sent people out to around the world, especially South Africa, to bring back samples. And the botanical description of this plant was actually made from his garden in London. So the idea behind this was to try and reconstruct these smells as a way to think about these lost landscapes. And this is part of a film that I made where I wanted to use this trope of the sublime landscape as a way to think about how we're reconstructing these memories. This is a flower that I've never smelled, I've never experienced, a landscape that doesn't exist. But can we start to think about extinction, sort of looking in this other way at it, so reconstructing the past and looking at what problems that presents. So the scientific process behind this is really extraordinary. So when Christina took little bits of tissue, little bits of the leaf from the specimen, the pressed flower in the herbarium, the challenge then was to try and get DNA out of it. And it turns out that even DNA, which is 100 or 200 years old, is already very degraded, and so it's all in kind of tiny fragments. So they worked with scientists or paleogeneticists who are experienced at doing this from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and they were able to extract these tiny amounts of DNA, which were all kind of broken up in pieces. So number 2 on this diagram, they were able to read these little sequences. And then as we move to number 3, they were able to use computation to match up these fragments with known sequences from other organisms which have been studied. And we know that those genes actually produce fragrance producing enzymes. So they could go through sort of a puzzle process, match the pieces up and find the missing pieces. And then they had a final gene sequence, which they could then print using a DNA synthesizer. And then those sequences of DNA were inserted into yeast. And so the yeast is then instructed to grow these molecules, and it's brewed up like you'd brew beer. And you have these molecules in the soup, and the smell profile, the identity of each molecule can be checked using mass spectrometry, which is what you see in number 7. So we see the signature profile of it. And we end up with the name of a smell molecule. And this process was repeated for each smell molecule or each gene that was predicted in each plant. And what you end up with is basically a shopping list of chemicals, which are the molecules that we think that the plant produced. So these lists were then sent to Sissel, and this is her studio in Berlin. And it's unlike most studios, so she constructs smells as her practice. So she reconstructed the smells of each flower from these lists. And I say reconstructed is because it's a very poor reconstruction. And what I mean by that is we don't know what quantities these molecules were in within the plant. We don't know whether the flower actually produced these smells, whether they were just functional things in the plant or whether they were actually part of the flower's fragrance. And we don't even know if the genes were turned on. We have lots of genes in our DNA which aren't switched on. So what we have is a really imperfect way of looking at the past. We can't reconstruct these flowers just by using DNA. You need to be in the business of conservation and protection of landscapes to do that. So to bring attention to this, I designed these installations using, again, this sort of familiar model of the Natural History Museum vitrine. So inside these vitrines, one on the left is for the hibiscus and the one on the right is for the urbexulum, you were able to sort of capture the smell within this glass box. And these rocks, each one is relevant to the landscape that the plant came from. So lava on the left and limestone on the right. And what you end up with is this is the only tangible remnant of this landscape that's left, is this, just the geology. The biology is gone. Inside this volume is the smell of the lost flower, and surrounding it is a immersive soundscape which we made to kind of create a sense of the organisms that you can't see but were there, so insects and the sound of the climate. And what you really see here are humans looking at other humans, which is a kind of a switch up of what you would normally find in a natural history museum. And the most recent iteration of this, actually you can see one of these vitrines at the Venice Architecture Biennale at the moment, but this version, which is in the Natural History Museum in Bern, is a particular favorite of mine. So the Natural History Museum in Bern has these fantastic old-fashioned dioramas, sort of animals posing or being put in poses by humans with painted backdrops, the kind of the best kind of natural history museum from the past that's sort of deeply problematic, but at the same time very aesthetically appealing in some ways. So I wanted to play with that since we were in this venue, and it's part of an exhibition called Apocalypse, so a long-term installation in this show. And as you go through the whole exhibition, as you come to the end, you're just faced with this back door. And you go in through the back door and you go around a corner and you suddenly find yourself inside the diorama. And again, all we have left is the geology, the smell surrounding you, and the soundscape within. And you kind of sit on the rocks. And what you can't really see from inside, because the lights are so bright, are the people outside looking at you. And eventually you can step outside and watch the people on the inside. So really kind of enjoying this idea of the human on view. And the idea is to put the human at the center of the extinction story. We can feel uncomfortable being watched. This is our role in the story. There's nothing left to see, just us. I still haven't seen this because of the pandemic, so this was a very strange remote installation. So we have each of these three flowers, and what we're left with is this imperfect memory, but it's still incredibly I find it incredibly touching, because these are three flowers that I never even knew about. I would never have known about these things. Really obscure. Each one grew in a very specialized, tiny location. So you could say that they're sort of failures in the history of biology because they were so specialist. They didn't grow widely. But another way of thinking about it is that every extinction matters. If one of these plants had a pollinator that only fed on that plant and only pollinated that plant, that pollinator is gone. And there may be a bird that only ate that pollinator. And you start to see this cascading impact even of individual extinctions. And from that point, we start to see landscape change, sort of habitat change, as these ecosystems break down, and habitat change and landscape change so leads to climate change. So each of these plants matters. There are a few 100,000 plant species known on Earth, and 3 are lost. So in the kind of through this practice of creating these sublime landscapes, and I wanted to bring in the sublime here because of this sense of awe and terror, not just at nature, but at technology, that we can reach back into the past and get this view. To me is something really kind of sends shivers down my spine. So at the front here is, you see the leucadendron in our reconstruction, video. And I'm particularly excited about this landscape, and I know it well because my family are from South Africa, from Cape Town. And I learned about a project while we were doing the research. This is a photograph of that same location. So we'd already presented the project for the first time. And I learned about a research project that was going on in Cape Town. And the idea was to burn this exact plot of land where this flower once grew. It's a very small area called Wynberg Hill, and it's now part of suburban Cape Town. And a landowner there had an old farm with a pine plantation on it, and the pines had been planted in colonial times. So we knew that the soil hadn't been ploughed. And this conservation charity, steat, had devised a plan to do a controlled burn of this environment to create a biodiversity corridor, but also because they also knew about this extinct leucadendron, and they thought there could be this tiny possibility that there might be a seed buried in the soil for a few hundred years. And since this kind of flora regenerates through fire, that maybe a seed would be there, would germinate. The soil is a kind of archive, a living archive or a dormant archive that could be reactivated through fire. And we could have a story of hope about an extinction that is no longer an extinction. So I tracked this for years, and this burn kept on being delayed. So there was some terrible periods of drought in Cape Town over a couple of years. Then the next year it was rain. Rain called it off. So it was you can't burn the soil if it's wet because you'll sterilize it. And then last year there was the pandemic, so it was cancelled. So we decided this was never going to happen. And then we suddenly heard that it was going to happen. We were able to send a film crew and photographers down and capture this extraordinary thing in the middle of the suburbs, with a fire raging at 1,000 degrees across this patch of a couple of hectares. And I was so excited a few weeks ago to receive these photographs from our friend Anthony, who was doing this, of the first flowers blooming. He said, no sign yet of the leucadendron, but we live in hope. And that's what's so kind of sort of fascinating. You have these two contrasting ways of playing with the archive. The soil as the archive, or the archive as the archive, and thinking about different strategies of conservation. We can try and reconstruct. We can try through conservation to rebuild lost environments. But really all that we ever have is this approximation of what it was like. Biology has moved forward, evolutionary processes move forward, the climate has moved forward. It's not necessarily better or worse, it's just different. So we just have these vague memories that are left. So this work and Mars are two things that I made after I finished my PhD, so around 2018, 2019. And this was sort of the way I was thinking is, we need to ask questions and tell stories, and this is what this work does. But I think there's something missing, or for me, sort of presenting these projects in exhibitions, in museums and galleries, I started to feel my own panic rising about what am I asking people to do? I'm evoking a sense of loss and a sense of connection to the natural world through these visceral soundscapes and smellscapes and experiences where you don't really need to know what's going on. There's something that's unsettling and wrong. But then I started to sort of wonder what else I could be doing. And I talked about imagining alternatives, imagining better. But there's also this question of agency. I feel a lack of agency. I don't know what to do about my own panic in the climate and biodiversity emergencies. And how can I use my practice to experiment in a different kind of way? And this leads to the Pollinator Commission for the Eden Project, which launches in 10 days. So I'm quite tired, so I apologize if I'm not making sense. And it's really exciting to be able to share with you the name, which only got announced yesterday. So it's called Pollinator Pathmaker. And it's kind of grown into this incredible, complicated thing, which I can't wait to share a little bit with you. You have to revisit in 10 days. So if you know about the Eden Project or are ever going to come to the UK, it's this extraordinary ecological attraction in Cornwall in the southwest of the UK in an old clay pit. And this place is very different to a botanical garden. It has a rainforest inside the biome on the right-hand side, like a living rainforest. But it's much more interactive than a botanical garden. It's not a history, it's not a collection of the past. Instead, it has this really exciting mission. What I found really inspiring was they want to create in the visitor a sense of connection with the natural world, a sense of awe, and also a sense of jeopardy about what's happening to it, and then to inspire hope and give people agency to do something. And that really resonated with me. And I was asked to propose a new work for an art commission about pollinators. And it's part of a bigger program called Create a Buzz, which is being launched to bring attention to the plight of pollinators. So decline in Germany, I think 75% of insects have disappeared in the last 30 years. It's completely horrifying. And without pollinators, we're totally stuck. There are no kind of working ecosystems. And what I found really kind of provocative about this brief was that I was being asked to create an artwork about pollinators, and yet I was being given 55 meters of prime real estate for a minimum of 5 years in Eden's gardens. So I suggested that instead I'd make an artwork for pollinators, not about them, and this seemed like a good way to spend some time outdoors. As I started to research this, I knew very little about pollinators, just like I know very little about anything I start making work about, but it's a way to learn. On the left-hand side is how we see, I think it's a pelargonium flower, and on the right-hand side is an approximation of the colors that a bee would see. So bees have see a different part of the light spectrum to us. They don't see red, instead they see UV. So little markings on the flowers become visible that we can't see. Meanwhile, a butterfly sees in a completely different way because they can see 4 colors, red, green, blue, and UV. So these flowers look different to each of them. And it's not just color, it's also depth. So a bee has a higher flicker threshold, which offsets their compound eyes. So the compound eye means that at 6 centimeters, they're not seeing much. But the higher flicker threshold of the way their eyes work means that as they fly past flowers, they can see them individually, whereas we see a blur. So they're perceiving depth and color differently. They see the world differently to us, or we see differently to them. So I began to wonder, what does a landscape look like to an insect? The way we assume the world looks like the world looks because we can see it that way, but it's just because our biology works in a certain way and is sending signals to our brain, and then we understand it. So on the right would be the colors as we can represent it that a bee would see. Bees are also, and I'm not just focused on bees, but I'm using them as examples, have extraordinary abilities to memorize landscape. So a bee goes on a foraging mission for the first time, and it finds some patches of flowers, and it can memorize the locations of those flowers, and it finds the fastest route between them. And if a bee visits 10,000 flowers in a day, shaving seconds off your journey time is incredibly important. This is really something that's a very complex mathematical problem to solve. It was called the traveling salesman problem. So this became my question was, if pollinators designed gardens, what would humans see? We think of the garden, I showed the Garden of Eden, we think of the garden as this place that we create for us, but what is it actually for? Who does it serve? So I began to think about creating a way to make gardens that to try and enter into their world, and to ask, what would it look like? Can we design for pollinators' tastes, not human taste? And what would that look like? So is it something completely different? So I decided to design an algorithm, and I worked with a wonderful collaborator who's a string theory physicist to solve this. And we defined the algorithm as creating the most empathetic garden possible. And I had to define that as supporting the maximum pollinator species possible. So the algorithm will always solve a garden design to serve as many species. I can't show you any more pictures. So this is one from last year when I was proposing this. So trying to think about what this kind of garden might look like. But it does exist. We planted the one at Eden 2 weeks ago, 7,000 plants over 55 meters, and it will formally open next spring. And I can also tell you that there's going to be one in Berlin that will open next June as well, which is very exciting. And this is a tiny little sneak peek of a little bit of it. So it's all laid out in this grid system created by the algorithm. But this whole work is about this notion of care and trying to create a way to give people agency to feel empathy and to care for other species. And the work itself is actually more than just this garden at Eden. It's this whole network that I've created. So for the UK garden, we created a plant palette, which is actually suitable for a lot of Northern Europe. That plant palette has 160 plants in it, and the algorithm chooses from those plants to solve the problem. That algorithm is then going to be available on the website, which launches on the 3rd of November. And anyone can play with the same algorithm and create their own edition of the garden and which they can then plant. So I've just planted one here on the weekend. That's just a little plot of 5 by 4 meters. And then through a commissioning model, which is quite novel, we are inviting other institutions like our partners Light Art Space in Berlin to commission a whole new plant palette, which is suitable for their region, which then is donated back to the website. So they will create a large garden, but then visitors to their garden can go on the website and create their own gardens using the local plant palette. So much smaller scale gardens are possible. But each is an artwork for pollinators and a call to action to bring attention, but also to get people to be able to help with this problem. So please follow us on Instagram. We launched the Instagram yesterday, just in time for today. So we need to make as many of these as possible. You can do it in a community space, in a backyard, on a pavement, anywhere. We need more of these pollinator pathmaker gardens. So just to kind of sum up in the end, a lot of what I'm asking is using technology as a way to ask this question of what is better for nature. How can we think differently about what we're doing? How do we, if all we have is our imagination, how do we imagine what better might be for other species and for all species? Who gets to imagine? This is such a crucial question. How do we have agency to be part of this process? Because otherwise, who gets to decide? And as we come up to COP, we know, this is not going to be the kind of solution to the world's and the environment's problems. So all I can ask you to do is to try and ask what is better, to imagine alternatives and see if there are ways through your own practice if you can enable better. There are no solutions. Pollinator pathmaker gardens are not going to solve the problem of pollinator decline, but the idea is to get people thinking about what the world looks like from other perspectives. So I'll end there, and I can't wait to hear Paolo's way that he's approaching these same issues and questions. Thank you.
We can hear you. Is there anybody speaking? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Wonder if they can hear us in the room. Okay. Yeah, can you hear? I don't know if the connection is too good here. There's something I cannot hear you from the audience. Okay, great. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I really appreciate the invitation, the framing of the project, the energy, you know, the sort of commitment to transdisciplinarity, and as well as the conceptual frame, which involves the notion of care. Also, thank you, Alexandra. It's great to meet you and kind of share some ideas this afternoon. I speak to you from Brazil. I live in the capital called Brasilia. It's the center of the country. And yeah, again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to try to, share my screen. Let's see if that's going to be possible. Hold on a second. Okay. All right. Can you see my screen? I can see. You can see. Yeah. Great. So I think the framing of my talk maybe could be, you know, defined in three major questions or major propositions. The first one, if the cities are right, if spaces are right, if territories are right, if the environment is all right, and we know that it is, at least it's the 70s by different international treaties, then architecture, which is my field of practice, should be defined as a form of advocacy. The second question is that the ecological crisis is not only a question of environmental repair, or may we say environmental care, but foremost a question of historical reparation. And I think this question of reparation and care is super important for us to think in terms of the ecological crisis of today, as well as the maintenance of systems of power that still, let's say, continue unfolding based on racial capitalism. Finally, the idea that digital information, the way in which we relate to planet Earth, configures a new side of intervention, providing tools and media to empower architecture or spatial practice to produce advocacy. And I guess in relation to care, you see that my talk is not totally tailored for the idea of care, but in reflecting on the idea of care, I think that one thing that is important for me is that sometimes, or most of the times, the idea of care, because it's connected to, you know, attention, it's connected to looking after, it's connected to concerns, it becomes somehow depoliticized, right? Because care, in fact, is not something pacific. It's something that involves struggle, and something that, you know, might need to confront certain types of violence. It's something that should be protected and cared for, and it involves a set of technologies, a set of ways in which we can care to things, and you know, and it's deeply involved in struggles, right? In political struggles. So there's a kind of politics of care that's not pacific, right? If you think about those who care for the forest are those who are the front lines of fighting climate change, and are also those who most of the times are killed politically or confront certain types of political repression because they are caring and nurturing for the forest. So I want to, you know, think about this idea of care and what would be a politics of care and what care implies beyond the sort of more pacified way of conceiving it. And finally, I think that these ideas of we live in the ruins that you mentioned in the brief of the project is super important, specifically through Anat Singh. And I want to speak how, you know, in this world of ruins, we need to produce reparations and reconstructions. And I'm going to speak about different forms of environmental and architectural ruins and what I think is the means to reconstruct, repair those sites and communities, which is in itself a form of care. And again, a form of political care, if you will, and a care that's, I consider, not being pacified or abstracted from the political context in which it takes place. very briefly, just to give you a context, in Brazil, modernity was somehow defined as a process of what was called auto-colonization, right? So here you see a very famous Brazilian sociologist, Gilberto Freire, saying that the colonization of Brazil soon ceased to be strictly European to become a process of auto-colonization, a process that would, after independence, take on a national character. Another important intellectual in Brazil, Nelson Werneck Sodré, would define Brazil of today as obeying the imperative dialectic of a country that needs to conquer itself. He speaks about a politics of intra-border imperialism. And finally, President Getúlio Vargas, who ran Brazil from the 30s as a dictator for 15 years, starting the revolution of 1930, he's going to say that, and he's going to implement, in fact, that Brazil has a kind of self-imperialism. And this is a kind of self-expansionism within our own borders. And this reenactment of this colonial gesture is what defines Brazil as a modern nation, right? And Getúlio Vargas implemented that in a program that he called March to the West, very much in the way this kind of frontier imaginary that's also very important in the definition of nationality and identity in North America became also very important in Brazil, in the sense that the modernist project, the modern project, was about conquering the interior, domesticating the interior, civilizing the interior. It is the capital, Brasilia, where I am, where we see, this materializing perhaps in the most clear architectural form. So Lúcio Costa, the designer of Brasilia, would say that Brasilia was born as a deliberate act of possession, a gesture still in the sense of the pioneers, that is along the lines of the colonial tradition, to axis crossing at the right angle, that is the sign of the cross. So Brasilia, the urban layout of Brasilia is this cross sign. Some people would associate Brasilia with an aeroplane flying towards progress. The capital was built in 5 years in between 1955 and 1960. But in fact, Brasilia is not an airplane flying towards progress, but it's a cross demarcated on the ground as a reenactment of a colonial gesture. And this comparison between the cross and the airplane also, reveal to us this kind of structural relationship between modernization and coloniality. Here's some image of the march of Brazilian construction. Now, again, this idea that modernization was about taking the interlands. And it's interesting to see that to commemorate the beginning of the building of Brasilia, President Juscelino Kubitschek had ordered to realize a Catholic Mass. This altar was designed by modern architect Oscar Niemeyer. And President Kubitschek also ordered the Brazilian Air Force to bring a cohort of indigenous people, the Carajá people, to this Catholic Mass, because he wanted somehow to reenact a very famous scene in Portuguese colonization, which is the first Mass. The Portuguese, the Europeans, when they come to the South, the first thing they would say in taking possession of territory would be to celebrate Catholic Mass, to establish a cross in the land. And here we see a kind of famous representation of this scene by a 19th century painter called Victor Meirelles. And again, this idea that another symbol that modernity is, a form of colonization itself. So this is what I call terra nullius, tabula rasa, kind of colonial concepts in conjunction with a modern concept. And when the military took power in Brazil in '64 in a US-backed coup d'etat, this idea of conquering the interior was scaled up, was intensified in a very dramatic way. And I'm going to show you just some images of this project implemented by the military regime, which was a 20 years dictatorship, the idea that the interior of Brazil should be occupied and integrated. So these are some images of my archive. You see how modern planning was really put at service of an ideology that was fundamentally colonial. And the idea that the forest, that the environment should be domesticated, should be civilized. And here we see this idea of, the Amazon as a space of modernization, of industrialization, but at the same time, the propaganda of the military regime was connecting this idea of conquering Amazonia, conquering the forest with, you know, the colonial past, as if there was a continuation in the very identity of Brazil was, you know, in this conquering of the interior. Some image so we can see how architecture was really sort of instrumentalized and served not only as an ideological means to, you know, legitimize this idea of colonization, but also as a proper instrument on the ground, operationalizing the destruction of the forest, if you will, by the implementation of new cities, by the implementation of new settlements. And here we see, you know, a city of Sinop in 79 in the middle of the forest. And of course, that this project, this colonial modern project, catalyzed and produced large-scale environmental destruction. This image, I like it very much because we see that the patterns of destruction in Amazonia that emerged during the military leadership, they're not the product of lack of government, of lack of planning, but in fact, they are the result of certain type of planning, of a certain type of rationality whose core is colonial. I call it ecocide by design, right? And many environmentalists would say that this was a process of ecocide produced by the military regime. And I would say that this was ecocide by design. And here we see the before and after of one of these large-scale interventions produced by the military regime in a satellite image. And we can just have a glimpse of the level and the scale of environmental destruction that was produced along these 20 years. Of course, that those territories were not empty, although the ideology was that those were so-called demographic vacuums. This was a territory completely populated by the indigenous nations. So in order to conquer this land, the government the Brazilian state created an agency called the Service for the Protection of the Indians, who operationalized a politics that was called officially politics of pacification. So basically what this politics were to map those indigenous territories and then contacting those populations, usually by bringing a set of Western instruments in order to, quote unquote, pacify them, in order to bring them to the realm of the nationality, in order to bring them to the realm of Western civilizations, so to say, and eventually also making use of, you know, religious dispositives to colonize indigenous peoples. And this strategy was very much, you know, a strategy whose origins are in colonial times. So here we see, you know, on the right hand side, we see an indigenous post produced by the Brazilian state in the forest. And on the left hand side, you see what was called Aldeamento de Índios in 18th century. So the sort of methods, the sort of, you know, the way in which this politics operated was you establish an outpost, and then you would contact indigenous groups and try to bring them within this outpost. So therefore you could clear out their lands to be colonized, right? So the national settler state could occupy these lands because people were concentrated in these indigenous posts. And this is a map of the network of those outposts that's operationalized the politics of pacification. You can see there was a kind of wide-ranging sort of network practically occupying the entire territory of Brazil. And I always like to compare this map with a kind of incredible map produced by an anthropologist called Curti de Muendaju in the 40s, which is the left-hand side map, where you see he mapped all the indigenous groups in different languages and kinships that occupied Brazil at this moment. And what we see is a kind of colored patch territory, what I call plurinational a formation, right? Many different nations kind of coexisting and inhabiting the same territory. And of course, that the plan of the totalitarian state or the military state of Brazil was to enforce a kind of hegemonic notion of nationality. That is to say, to completely, to completely erase this kind of national, linguistic, cultural diversity in order to produce an idea of Brazilian nationality, or by conquering this territory and incorporating it into the realm of the nation state. So we know that besides the environmental destruction realized by the military government, it was also a regime of terror, right? People were kidnapped, people were tortured, people were disappeared because they held ideological beliefs completely different from what the totalitarian government of the dictatorship want to implement it. So we need to acknowledge not only the violence of the environment, also the violence against activists, and specifically against indigenous peoples. And here I'm going to show two projects that I have been involved with, which I call advocacy projects, where we mobilize a set of different sort of digital tools and architectural instruments to provide evidence of the violence committed by the Brazilian state against indigenous peoples during this campaign of pacification. The first one I call Botanical Archaeology. So this is about the Quina people. The Quina people live like right in the middle of Amazon. What you see now in the screen are the sort of plan of pacification of the Quina people. You see that there was a flyover, there was the mapping of the settlements. And here on the right-hand side, you see the idea that all those little villages in the middle of the site would be removed to a kind of large settlement established by the Brazilian state in this campaign of pacification. And what really happened is that all those settlements somehow were destroyed during this campaign of pacification. These are only the images that we have of these ancient settlements. And our task here was to show where those settlements were, how many settlements it was there before the pacification campaign, right? Because in as much as the state was not present in this territory, we don't have the sort of biopolitical instruments of mapping territory and population. There was no maps of this region. There was no, demographic data and things like that, precisely because, those colonial instruments would arrive in this land. And we were commissioned by the public minister, which is implemented this legal case on behalf of the Quina people and against the Brazilian state because of the genocidal acts that were committed during the process of pacification. So we entered the project to provide a mapping of those sites that were forcibly removed or forcibly destroyed. So in order to do so, we used a technology that was developed to map the climate change. This technology allows for you to make a difference between primary forests or very ancient forests and forests that had just grown over fallow areas that have been deforested and a secondary type of forest. And this is very important in relation to climate change, because if you want to understand the carbon cycle of the earth, you need to understand the difference between the ages of the forest, what is an old forest to a young forest, because they hold different levels of carbon in biomass. So you need to have this sense what is the age of the forest, so you can precisely measure the carbon balance and how much carbon they store in biomass. And we use this mapping climate change technology to map violations of human rights, to map forms of state violence. So here is, I'm going to run how this coding works. So here is the kind of real color satellite image, the way humans would see it. And when you run the code, what you see is that, for example, areas like here that appear, as homogeneous green are in fact very young forests. So the green forest, the light green is the youngest forest, and the purple is forests that are 30 years old. So you can have this difference by using this code. It's interesting here as well, in real color, we see just an homogeneous green, and here we can, of course, analyze that this, in fact, is very sort of, young forest or forest 30 years old. Everything that is in gray is a very, very old forest, right? So here you have a kind of precise mapping of deforestation. And we did the same coding over Quina village. And what you see is quite interesting, because you see that the little village, in fact, occupies a much larger space. You see that this environment is changing, these forests are changing. Here as well is very interesting, because, you see that those cleared spots are in fact much larger in the way that they deal with the land. And what's interesting is that you see some very young patches of forests that we cannot identify in real color emerging in the screen. Here again, we see the footprint much larger than what we see in the real color satellite image. And we ran this code to the middle of the Quina territory. And what's fascinating is that you start to see this sort of a bubble-shaped purple patches appear in different areas of their territory, indicating that those spots are in fact 30 years old patches of forest. And here we run the code again, and we see remarkably a series of this, 30 years old forest patches that most probably are the remains or indexes where those village sites, those settlements were located. They are really compatible to some of the archive images in their kind of urban layout, so to speak. So there are clear evidences of, the sites where those settlements that were forcibly removed or eventually destroyed are located. And of course, they have a kind of sacred, also a cultural importance to the king, in as much as their loved ones, their ancestors have been buried in these lands and they have been living in those ancient sites for many years. And if you run the code here in the King Act territory, you see, those clusters of villages. So something that appears completely not occupied, a kind of, homogenic patch of green, in fact, is a very well-structured network of villages and garden sites organizing according to the water streams of the forest. So a site that was somehow completely occupied, and those patches indicate those villages that have been forcibly removed by the military. So it's interesting to see that, a forest, something that we consider part of nature, is in fact a form of ruin or a form of remain or an index of a former indigenous settlement. And I want to work with this idea that looking at those forest sites, in fact, what we are looking at are not evidence of natural evolution, but it's a kind of evidence of a type of coexistence or a type of cooperative design between ancient indigenous groups and the many life forms that occupy the forest. So can we see those trees, those palm trees, as index of history, as saturated with memory? This is another project, somehow relatively similar, called Memory of the Earth. So again, we worked with different lawyers of the public ministry in Brazil in a legal case that they put forward against the Brazilian state because of the genocidal acts committed against the Xavante Awe people. I'm going to speak always Xavante, during the pacification campaign of the Xavante. So the Xavante lives in a kind of borderline between the sort of savanna-like environments of central Brazil and the more humid forest sites of Amazonia. And they occupied a very huge territory for hundreds of years, and the pacification campaign in their land removed them from their original sites. And particularly in this group, which is called the group of Maraiatsede, they were forcibly removed by an operation conducted by the Brazilian Air Force. Moved away about 500 kilometers from the original land. So we were commissioned again to try to provide a certain architectural intelligence, so to speak, to identify where the settlements of the Xavante people were before the pacification campaign. And once again, contrary to an urban setting, we didn't have sort of mappings of this territory, precisely because all those biopolitical instruments of governing people and land were not placed in this area, in as much as the sort of colonial machine with its mappings, cartographies, census and data were arriving precisely to colonize this territory. So what we did is we did an investigation in archives of modernist sort of media which portray this pacification campaign as a sort of civilizational endeavor that characterize Brazilian nationality, that characterize Brazil as this modern state, conquering and domesticating its land. And here we see a photo reportage of one of the most well-known modernist photographers called Jean Mazon. And he was part of these reconnaissance flights that the military or the Brazilian state did before, beginning with the pacification on the ground, somehow to map the area and see how they could strategize to enter or invade those indigenous territories. So although those images, their sort of code is sort of documents of civilization, right? Or documents of progress, of modernity. In fact, they are also sort of testimonies of a colonial campaign. And how can we change the register of these images from something that want to express modernity as something that, embodies or reveals or hold an evidence, a testimony of a violent campaign of displacement, because finally what we are seeing here is the forefront, the frontier of this campaign of displacement. So we did what they call a media archaeology through examining those photographs of those settlements that were forcibly removed. We start to reconstruct the architecture of those villages with digital tools. It's something that I call archaeology of media, right? So it was important for us to understand that those images, they were sort of documents of history, right? And somehow documents of violence. And then we need to understand the kind of urban layout of those spaces, right? The architecture of those spaces. So we could somehow reconstruct the territoriality of those communities before they were forcibly removed during the pacification campaign. So we did this kind of reconstructions, archaeological reconstructions. I'm going to go over this a bit quickly. Reconstructing those settlements. This was the first time that it was done. There was never reconstruction of initial settlements like this before, and it's quite impressive in their architecture, in the urban layout. And together with this, we also investigated a series of formerly classified satellite images of a global surveillance program conducted by the US military during the Cold War. And basically what the Americans did is, to launch a satellite with a photograph camera with very good resolution, kind of impressive resolution for the time, between the 60s and the 80s, and basically make a picture of the whole Earth, right? Make a picture of the whole Earth. So somehow those images register certain histories, right? They can be read not only as images of the nature of the Earth, right? But it can also be read as documents of history. And what is quite impressive is that we found several traces on the Earth, several sort of marks that indicate the presence of those settlements. They always follow the same pattern, this arch open to a water stream, and we found many of them in even those images which are quite new from the 60s and 70s. It seems that the Cervantes settlements, they were so, ancient that they left deep sort of marks in the land. Somehow here, the land itself becomes an archive. The land itself becomes a kind of book in which history is written, right? So identify different of these patterns. And again, it's very compatible with the reconstructions, the archaeological reconstructions that we did to the media. So this project turned into a document, a kind of legal document that's, is part of the legal case against the Brazilian state. But we also made sure that we could produce a book with this analysis, because it was the first time that this archaeological complex that, spread over the entire area where the Chavante lived was produced. So this is the first sort of archaeological investigation, and we made sure to produce books. So these books could be delivered to the schools of the Chavante communities, and this is what we did. We distributed about 300 books throughout their lands in the schools. The other project I want to show, it's also like a kind of continuation of Memory of the Earth, and I call it Trees, Vines, Palms, and Other Architectural Monuments. So when we look at this image of this geoglyphs, of these marks on the Earth in a contemporary satellite image, what we're going to see is that a patch of vegetation, trees, vines, and palms had grown over the layout, the spatial layout of the village, right? This is very clear in this image that those trees somehow emerge as a result of, the ways in which those communities were engaged with the land, they were inhabiting the land. So we want to see those sites, and we did what I call a landscape archaeology. We visit those sites that we mapped with, indigenous elders who survived the genocidal process, and we went to map and document this village sites, and looking again at different aerial images made by the Brazilian state. What we see is the same pattern. We see a village in an ancient image, and we see that a patch of forest, a patch of vegetation had grown where those communities had lived. This is the village site of Bou. Bou was the major geopolitical and cultural center of the Chavante community. And here in this drone flight, we see, this rainbow is a very dense patch of forest because it's most probably, a village from the 18th century or early 19th century. And, it was kind of the center, the geopolitical center. We see this, again, this patch of vegetation, this botanic formation that grows on the top of the old village. Here, again, the village of Obdonoyu, and here, the village of Ticino. So I'm going to play a video. I think I have the time. Let me try to share a video with you because I think this could be interesting for us to understand the context. Let me try to do this. Hold on. Oh, this is not going to do it. I hope you can see the video. If the video is not playing right, we can, I can show other things, but maybe it would be interesting to see at least just a bit of the video. Can you see the video? Ah, yeah, I can see on the screen. Hold on. Can you hear the sound? No? Sorry, can you hear or not? Sorry. Okay, so I can talk over it in sorry, I just understand. Sorry, the audio is not super good when I hear you. Is the sound playing or not playing? Okay. So since we have the captions, I think I can speak over it and you can, watch the video. What we are doing that is we are entering into the site of this village bowl. So we are entering into this land, which is a private land. That's why we are jumping fences, because the village site of Bohu, which is this ancient geopolitical and cultural center of these people, is in the middle of a private farm, of a very large private farm. I'm going to forward this a little bit, just so you can see a bit of the testimony of the elder Policarpo. He was, our leader in those missions, and he's going to describe a little bit what he's seeing when we arrived to the site. And what was interesting is that we didn't translate this in real time. We just, let it go. And later, a friend of mine translated, and it's kind of incredible the way in which Policarpo, by seeing the trees, can recognize his ancient village. Oh, sorry. Okay, let me stop sharing this. It's quite remarkable for me, you know, how Policarpo has a way of hold on, I think there is something on the background still. Sorry. Okay. So kind of interesting for me, you know, how Policarpo, can you see now my screen, my PowerPoints? Yes? Yes, I can see now. Okay, so in a way, those trees are the vestige, the index of those sites, right? They're the ruins of those sites in a way, although they're not dead ruins, they're somehow living ruins. You know, can we see those forests, those trees as something architectural, as something that is the product of design, as something that's the product of landscape design, but one which, contrary to the Western ways in which nature is seen, that you need to domesticate, you need to, you know, control, you need to govern. This is a form of design that does not reduce biodiversity, but somehow it produces biodiversity, right? It produces the forest as a kind of living and inhabitable ruin. In a way, the city itself is an enormous ruin that, you know, layers on the top of each other are built in the city, and, you know, we embody this kind of environment saturated with history. The forest should be seen as an urban site as well. So in as much as those sites are not part of their land, they stay in foreign land, in private land. What we are doing now is that we are conceiving a petition for the Brazilian Institute of Artistic and Historic Heritage. So they should consider those trees as historic and artistic heritage of the Chavante people, as well as national historic and artistic heritage. There is to say, they should consider and protect those trees as architecture, as ruins of a very ancient settlement. And we are really using the kind of, you know, the language of those petitions, which is very much this language of ruins, right, of a ruination, and kind of documenting those ancient structures and, you know, and mapping them. And we are trying to use the same sort of codes, this, you know, archaeological sort of, you know, drawings and language that define, you know, ideas of artistic heritage to produce this petition. And I just came back from the land, and we went there to take the signatures of, you know, the chiefs of the different sites of village, the signature, so we can submit this petition. And here are some photos of this process. And I just want to finish this part showing, you know, Bou, the geopolitical and cultural center of the Chavante people, in an image of 2017, or probably in an image of now, right? What we can see is that the whole site had been deforested. Only the very center of the village was preserved. And there is reasons for that. The reason one is that the neo-fascist government of President Jair Bolsonaro is empowering people to, you know, occupy indigenous lands and deforested indigenous lands. So the destruction that we see here is a clear outcome of the sort of, you know, neo-fascist and xenophobic discourse of the incumbent president of Brazil now. And it's preserved just because, you know, the Chavante people went to the owner of the farm and, you know, pressured them not to destroy this specific patch of vegetation because there are cemeteries there. So when we are talking here, when we are talking about, you know, the ecological crisis, and we are talking about, you know, interspecies coexistence, and, you know, we are talking about, you know, caring for the land and caring for life, we need to understand that ecological crisis that we see today is not only a question of repairing environments, of repairing ecologies, but it's also a question of historical reparation. because the violence against people is connected to the violence against land, right? This the violence that see the process of pacification is similar, is correlative to the deforestation, right? So ideas of historical repair related to wrongs and rights violations committed in the past must come together with an idea that we are going to heal the earth. Those things are completely connected. And somehow, if you don't attach these two things, we are never going to, say, get out of the environmental crisis. And it's interesting to see, right? We see one of the Chavante lands and deforestation in 1986 and deforestation in 2006. We see that, the campaign of removal of these people, this is where their ecological sites are located, right? Outside the boundaries of their land. So they are under threats of this massive process of deforestation, which is also a process of destroying histories, of destroying monuments, of destroying heritage. And here's some images of the deforestation and this kind of large scale. And what's interesting to see is that this relationship between political violence and environmental violence that somehow is structured during the military regime continues up to today. So what we see here is a map of the so-called Arc of Fire in Amazonia. We see, the limits of Amazonia, the Amazon forest, and this red is the pattern of deforestation. They call it the Arc of Fire. And the little crosses that you see are indexes are pointing to places of political murders, of environmental rights, human rights, and nature rights activists defending the land. So therefore, the people who care for the land, right? Care is not something that can be pacified. The politics of care has to be attached to the struggles where they're happening, because to care for the life of the forest is above all to care for the life of the people who plant and nurture and care for the forest. And I think I have 5 minutes, so I just want to conclude with another sort of advocacy strategy using design, and that I think it's also connected to, this potential idea of what care might imply in terms of its technologies, in terms of its materiality, in terms of its agency, in terms of how, we leave the more conceptual framing to actions on the ground. How does it materialize? What technology does it involve, right? I showed a series of, high-end technologies, codings of satellite maps and digital reconstructions. And I think, the practice of care in materializing this whole set of technologies as well. And here we are going to show a very low profile technology, but nonetheless, a very simple project, but nonetheless very dear to my heart and I think important. So usually when, a land is recognized in Brazil, the government needs to put plaques, signs, and boards around the land to say that this is indigenous territory, right? And in this land of the Chavante people, there was none of those signs. And we were invited by an NGO to do workshops on environmental and territorial monitoring with the community, empowering, sharing knowledge on sort of Western digital technologies like, GPS and, and mappings and Google Earth and all those sort of instruments that became sort of common for us to navigating, say, territories and, introducing some of those instruments. So, we could empower the very community, most importantly, the youth, to conduct the monitoring of the territory themselves. So what we decided to do, instead of coming, stop the way down and saying, let's teach, GIS and, and cartography and Google Earth, which is, of course, something that's completely abstracted, right? In a way, Western knowledge is always about, quantifying and mapping and sort of abstracting the earth into numbers and lines and things like that. So instead of coming with this, we decided to approach in a kind of Paulo Freirean methodology of, the pedagogy of the oppressed, and to identify what was a question, that was part of their lives from which we could draw some sort of strategies, pedagogic strategies of this workshop to, share the knowledge on environmental territorial monitoring. And during these conversations, it came to us that this this question of the territory not being demarcated by those boards was something very important. And in as much as we needed to place those signs within the territory in different points, they could function as a kind of pedagogic device around which we could, start to teach and share knowledge on, geolocalization, GPS positions, and cartography, and all the sort of instruments to map and monitor the Earth. So we did several, workshops and to discuss what should be written, how it should be done, what is the size, what should be written there. And it was really interesting. And mainly we worked with the youth, also upon the call of the elders who really want to transmit, the importance of the territory, the importance of maintaining and caring for the land. And we produced those boards. And it was, as I mentioned, a very low-tech, a simple project, but in a way, I think it also implies a kind of agency, an advocacy agency, and an agency of care. So here's the plaque, and here's the last image that I took when I came back this June, when you see a shot in the middle of the plaque. I went for this now. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that the transmission was okay, minimally okay, and you could understand. Thank you so much for the attention and for being paying attention on the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you for your rich and thought-provoking talks. And at first sight, your practice seems quite different, I would say. But what unites them, however, that I would say that they both challenge our conventional modernistic categories and our conventional perspectives on the topic of coexistence. Daisy, your works are promoting a post-human design, a design that is non-anthropocentric, be it in terms of function or even aesthetics, but rather focuses on needs and the flourishing of non-humans like bees or plants. And I'm, of course, thinking especially of your work, Pollinator Pathmaker. And your approach and your research, Paolo, seems to promote a non-modernistic and animistic perspective, and it is especially challenging our hegemonic and still colonialist narratives, which are, among others, based on a strict boundary drawing between domesticated and wild and cultivated and uncultivated, or artificial and natural. Would you both agree on this? And is it right to summarize somehow that the questioning of our modernist worldview, our Western knowledge systems, our histories, our myth of progress is very fundamental, or is a precondition for realizing or even thinking non-colonialist and non-paternalistic ways of coexistence?
Yes. Yeah, I'm done now.
Okay, well, yeah, okay, of course. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on this, or maybe you would? Yeah.
From my perspective, you summed it up really beautifully. I think maybe the bit I would add, I also agree there were so many things that we were talking about, the same sort of words, but approaching it so differently. So thank you, Paolo, for sharing your work as well, in which I knew of, but to hear you talk about it is so great. I think for me, this just the core bit of trying to change the perspective. So with designing for other species, it's not really designing for other species, it's designing for humans to think about other species. And there's a humor embedded in my work, but it's using it as a strategy. So I use humanoid as a political strategy, or putting the human in the vitrine, or playing with these different methods of very subtly asking people to think in a different way, rather than just telling them, but allowing them to come to the conclusion, is one of my strategies. But this idea of the heterotopia, I think, is at the heart of, because I've come from this place of challenging the myth of progress and challenging, exactly as you describe it, the hegemony of modernism and how it structures our modern brains, and how it takes so much work to step out and recognize what has created us in this Western model. That I would also use, I would just say that a lot of what I'm doing is also about using design as a lens to turn back on ourselves, to think about why we make stuff, why we behave how we do, whether that stuff is societies or laws or things.
Yeah, I totally agree, and totally agree with both comments. And maybe to add to that, I think there was a text I wrote for my participation in this Istanbul Design Biennial. It's called "In the Forest Ruins." This idea of the ruin and the living ruin and things like that. And at the end, I make a point that I call design beyond the human, right? How would it be a form of design that would not be, Alexandra is putting non-human centric, right? What kinds of design could emerge? And I think that, the way in which we learn what is design, or the sort of foundations of, the notion of design, is very much anthropocentric, right? We are the homo designer, not, that's what defined the human, the possibility of designing, right? In a certain way, because we have to manage tools and we can build things, whereas, animals and bees and things like that, they have no agency, right? They're just sort of surviving. And I think we need to break with this and say, what would be, an idea of a design beyond the human? And I think, there is some sort of knowledge involved in this sort of living forest ruins, which I think, the work of Alexandra also capture when you're thinking about how can I generate a space for bees, right? And this concerns a way in which, other cosmologies grant agency to other beings. So design can never be something like in the Western sense of the word, where you come and you just, hammer things out and you change landscapes completely, and, you domesticate, you control and things like that, or eventually even make it better, a sort of nature. No, but you understand that there is, agency in all those elements. So all those elements somehow, in a way, are designing the landscape. They're designing finally the earth, right? So how can we sort of modulate those processes and, negotiate, or, in a kind of diplomatic sense, in a way, with these other beings, so we can provide a sense of coexistence, but also acknowledge that, the design of the landscape, the design of the earth, is a kind of shared a process in many ways, right?
I think,
sorry.
So the design is a human endeavor. It's absolutely, for me, is at the root of this idea of our ability to imagine. We are a dissatisfied species. Our survival is predicated on being able to improve our conditions, or imagining that it could be better if we go and, kill that tribe, or, bomb those people, and then everything will be good again. And that's very much at the heart of what keeps us going, I think, is this dissatisfaction, but the imagination that things could be better. And so we're cold, we build a shelter, we need something to carry water in, we make a jug. That's at the heart of design, is this idea of improving our circumstance. It's Richard Howells, who's a sociologist, calls it the utopian impulse of design. And I think that's exactly at the heart of this, is we're saying, well, what do we use it for? We just assume design makes things better, but who are we assuming it makes things better for? And how do we start to challenge this very tool of, like, if you think of design as like the physical embodiment of imagination, that things could be otherwise, who do you turn the lens on? So in the pollinator gardens I'm making, it's such a conscious choice. And I as I said, I planted mine on the weekends, like mad, crazy woman, 10 days before lunch, like, I have to get this garden in so I can take photographs of my own one, to set, the model. But in buying all these plants, I spent a lot of money buying plants, and it's like, I'm making a garden, I don't even know what it's going to look like. I can see a visualization using the algorithm. I know it looks crazy. My landlord is going to be, I don't know what he's going to say, because it's tall things next to short things. It's every color to suit every pollinator. It blooms throughout the year. I have no control. And I've just spent all this money and all this time, and it's not even for me to enjoy. And it's such a conscious thing that has happened. And like, I really worried, but I would never have planted a garden otherwise, because I don't know enough about gardening. So suddenly I had a recipe, and it's a recipe for other species. And it's this, just using design, this tool to switch it. And in the same way, Paolo, I think you're doing the same thing with your practice. I recognize that so much, but it's for also about the interrelationships between people and environments.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, my next question is come from design to technology. You both are working with technology in a very sophisticated way, I think. But I have the feeling, Daisy, or you already mentioned it, that you are also critical when it comes to technology, or especially you're critical of the illusion that you can do anything with technology, or you can revive plants or extinct species, and you can repair our relation to other species and so on. And maybe you want to comment on this, on your ambivalent relation to technology.
Yeah. Well, I use technology all the time to try and understand it. So, I mean, that's, I spent 10 years hanging out in laboratories with plates of bacteria. And then now I sort of start to look more broadly at other kinds of lively technologies. So things like AI, or things that are lifelike. But a lot of it is just sort of scratching my head thinking, why on earth do we protect? We spend billions, trillions are being spent on developing AI. And how much is spent on protecting rhinos? Like, it's completely mad. And it's this really interesting paradox that's revealed, this human desire for the new, for the better, for innovation, whether that is really a human desire or whether that's just the product of modernity, is kind of at the heart of that. So I'm in one way making fun of the technology by using it. But I'm learning about the technology, and I become implicated in the technology by pushing its abilities. And really, some of the works, another piece called Machine Auguries, I worked with Shemek, my string theory physicist friend, to rebuild the Dawn chorus using generative adversarial networks, so a kind of AI, to get the machines to sing like birds. And we actually pushing the boundary, because it's the first time generative adversarial networks have been used for sound in that way. So I'm advancing the same technology that makes deep fakes, but deeply implicated in it. But it's also a kind of Trojan horse in my cases. So I'm understanding it better, understanding how it works, understanding more of the issues it raises. But it's also a way to get people excited, because it's like, the first AI artwork with sound and birds, and then they sit there and what they're actually listening to is birds, and thinking, there's no birds outside. Why am I suddenly indoors listening to bird song? And it becomes a mechanism I'm using it in multiple ways. And with the pollinator pathmaker work, it's actually now using it, asking, can we, why are we making algorithms? We're making them to make our lives easier. What about if we switch it around? What does it mean to make an algorithm for other species? Does that even work? Because it's a thing full of human biases and human assumptions and anthropocentric choices at the heart of it. It's like, I don't know what a bee wants. I can use this tool to imagine, but it's not, it's only ever going to be a product of my own imagination.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in thinking how technology is part of this politics of care, right? How we sort of develop technology, what kinds of technologies we developed, if the central question is coexistence and care. And you know, I think, for example, if you think about the climate, for example, there's a whole network of technology that is the means by which any type of caring the planet could happen in a certain way, right? At the same time, we know that the best technology against climate change is a tree, right? Because the tree has a sort of technological functioning as well. So I wonder, you know, and I think that to think technology on those terms for me is important, right? How can we appropriate, and in my case, in relation to what I call the advocacy, in, you know, putting technology to work for other means, but what could be the sort of material network or infrastructures of care? We could call infrastructures of care, technological infrastructures of care in a sense. And finally, I think, you know, my view on technology is very much framed by the idea that technology doesn't have a sort of intrinsic use. It's always part of an agency. It's always part of, you know, a larger machine, a larger ensemble. So a hammer can be a weapon or a tool. It depends on the agency where, you know, the hammer is being used, how it's being used. So technologies are really open to, you know, both types of appropriation for destruction and creation. And I think that's the sort of the main question we need to address, because as Daisy was saying, I think, you know, this idea of going forward, you know, doing better, and the kind of assumption that design itself is kind of intrinsic for you to do better things is one of the, in my view, one of the sort of problematics of the ideology of design, that you do better things, that, you know, you improve or you develop or you make progress in a kind of linearity way that, you know, resembles very much Western ideas of evolution. I think if, you know, our ways of dealing with technology, maybe it's not to move forward. Maybe, you know, you need technology to, you know, access some ancestrality. Maybe, you know, you need to think about the different ways that these technologies can be assembled and things like that. But nonetheless, that said, I think that what we are seeing now is kind of the opposite. What we are seeing now is a big investment in terraforming, geoengineering technologies. We see major investments in, you know, spaceship traveling, you know, space traveling, things like that, the kind of reenactment of a certain type of frontier ideology that, you know, we are going to colonize Mars and things like that. And of course, that this is completely related to a system of power that, in my view, already considers that climate change is unfolding, and considers that, you know, the ecological crisis is going to generate deep social divisions, deep economic divisions, you know, and those who hold power are somehow already bunkering themselves, protecting themselves, or preparing for this, you know, climate apartheid that's coming to being.
Okay, thank you. So I want to open the floor for discussion, and the panel for discussion. And you're invited to pose your questions, so especially the students here in this room. But we have there's also the possibility to write something in the chat. So the people who are following us online have the possibility to write something in the chat, and we try, not to. I think it's impossible to answer every question, but we try to select at least some of the questions. So please go ahead with your question. And I think you have to come here, right? But we have no mic to bring to you. But, or can I just take it off? Okay, so I can't bring it to you. Don't be shy. Okay, perfect.
Hi, thank you very much, first of all. It's so good and so inspiring to have you here tonight with us. My question would be especially to Daisy, and about the crisis of imagination, and the question you addressed, like how we can think the better, and also who thinks the better. And this specifically with respect to your first project on the planned colonization of the Mars, which is a place that is very remote, and it is very much also characterized by the fact that it's not possible for us to be in the place. So my question would be, how can we think the better, starting from something that is so remote and so unthinkable in a sense, and that that is also something that we cannot directly engage with.
I was just saying it's a difficult question for a Friday evening. I don't know the answer. I mean, that's what I'm searching for. So I wrote this whole thesis about better because I was spending time with all these genetic engineers who I identified 3 groups within this little field that was burgeoning, and each had a different idea of what better was, and each of them were creating their own movement within this field, bringing people along and with the power to recreate biology in the form of what they thought was better. So one group I characterized, they want to kind of have an open source model so that anyone can play, with DNA and create stuff, and that you wouldn't be able to patent individual genes. Instead, it's the construction of parts. Whereas another group is all about industrialization and making big vats of expensive chemicals to put in face cream, because turned out it was much more lucrative to make face cream chemicals than to make fuel per liter. And the third group are like bringing back mammoths and engineering humans, and going in a totally different direction, trying to make nature better, but according to their idea of what better is, which is bettering humans, or sort of solving nature's problems through geoengineering or other kinds of methods. So the question is, well, what do we do? For me, it was getting involved at the table and infiltrating this field and hanging out with them, with these vision makers, and seeing how they exercised their power, how they built institutions around them and gathered people into their vision making. And it made me realize, well, anyone, not anyone can do it, but the idea, when you see the recipe for building a vision, then you get to see which people are making those visions. The Elon Musk model of space colonization as the solution to our problems, when we all know what, we can all imagine what Mars is going to be like. It's just another colonial outpost, but even harder to escape from. So I don't know, for me, the thing to hold on to is this idea of the heterotopia, that it's a place that we can construct in our imaginations. It's different. And then to relinquish this idea of the utopia, because one person's utopia is someone else's nightmare, because someone's going to be waiting on you hand and foot to make your dreams come true. And that's their dystopia. So thinking of this other world, this sort of parallel world where things are different, and then starting to create the rule sets for that. I think that's how I'm playing, basically. Like the Pollinator project is like, well, if I turn the tables and I'm not in charge, what does it end up looking like? That doesn't even begin to answer your question, but hopefully that's something.
Who's next? Any other questions?
Thank you. Both of you work with others, collaborate. I think sort of it's central to both of your practices. You were talking about your string physicist friend, for example. How do you find collaborators, or how do they find you?
They're the ones who reply to the emails.
Is it just like that you're interested in a topic and then you go, who can I talk to, and then
tends to be is the art of writing a good email. Just keep it very short. And then the art of finding collaborators, the person who replies because they found it interesting enough and it didn't fall out their inbox. It's very, I look people up on the internet and I ask them questions, and then I make friends. But Przemek, actually, Wityczek, the string theory physicist, came about through making a connection to an AI company that runs a fellowship scheme. And somehow I ended up being one of the host companies on the fellowship scheme. And I was competing for one of 15 AI scientists against Bloomberg, the Dow Jones, EasyJet. And then I was the weird company offering a fellowship position. and it was sponsored. So Shemek came to my studio for 6 weeks instead of going to the Dow Jones.
Fantastic.
So I just say, trouble. If you just think, how can I cause trouble? How can I write a good email that someone will actually read and is not hard for them to reply to? That's the way to find collaborator.
How about you, Paolo?
Let me think how I found collaborators. The email part is important. Some people who I collaborate with don't have emails, so I need to find other ways of, collaborating. I guess, it's kind of organic. It's kind of organic. Your interest pushes you to certain areas and you end up, especially I think, Daisy's mind practice is so sort of expanded, you're always searching not to be comfortable where you are and kind of reaching to other areas and transdisciplinarity and try to learn from other. So I think it's also part of the research process and, the persons who you are making a dialogue with, eventually, reading a book, eventually, studying the history of these people and things like that. So I think for me, it's kind of very organic in different ways. There is a dimension also, which is, those projects are not art projects by itself. They have this dimension in their, at times I do installations with them and things like that, but they have a kind of advocacy, legal, political dimension. And then your collaborators are, men of law and communities who are vulnerable and NGOs and agencies that are operating in the world and how you establish those networks. It's something super important. And when you work on the field, that you are really engaged with situations that, like myself, there is, different power forces operating that field, and you are, you're coming from outside that field. There is many different ways that you need to be aware of what you're doing and how you're doing and who you are working with, right? It's a kind of complicated, it's complex environment for you to navigate. So I guess in that sense, the collaboration scenes looks something important to me because how do you talk, the way you present project, with whom you talk, how you write an email. It's also like something crucial, specifically when there's political tension involved.
I think it's really interesting because in the parallel world of scientific power where I was hanging out, I used to go to a lot of scientific conferences and I'd present at them and find myself in very awkward situations where I was being asked to represent society, and I in no way represent society as a privileged white woman from the UK. And so getting in trouble with the political machinations because suddenly, sort of ministers getting, like you just say, how has this gone from me attending a science conference to now having the minister, like the government minister, sort of gate crashing my book launch because it's a power play with with one university and the other university, and somehow they've made, and you just like how. And you find yourselves, the stakes I think are much lower in the field I'm in, but you learn to dance around that and speak the right language and find ways to deliver the message in a subtle way that can, it's all about this idea of entryism. That's what I learned from the synthetic biologist I was hanging out with. Is, would you rather be at the table or on the outside as an activist? And I tested being at the table, and it's uncomfortable. And in the end, it was very uncomfortable.
I guess sometimes you need to be at the table. It's part of the way you can operate, and maybe there's a situation you need to be, in uncomfortable sort of positions. I guess this is part also with institutions. For example, I imagine you, Daisy, must have like different stories about that, how you work with an institution and some of your projects or art institutions, museum institutions, there is a way in which your project can be somehow instrumentalized to an agenda.
And I've walked away from collaborations with universities because, especially when I was dealing with synthetic biology, is when it happened, because I realized I was being politicized, and I was already in a difficult position because I was talking about a new technology that is controversial. And to talk about it, I had to tell people what it was. So for example, I was doing a residency in Australia in Perth, and I was meant to be doing, this was in 2009, I was meant to be working on synthetic biology at this university, but they didn't know about it yet. And I'd sort of gone over to do this art science residency. So I was telling everyone about it to be able to make work that was critical of it. And I ended up suddenly having tea at the governor of Western Australia's house with the senior scientist of the state of Western Australia, telling the governor about synthetic biology, having my photo taken, put in the local newspaper about like visiting scientist tells governor about synthetic biology, and like the head of the art science thing was like, what did you do? And I was like, I was just trying to do a research project, and I ended up having tea at Government House. And yeah, it's like that. It's like, and suddenly you are becoming the promoter of a technology.
Yeah, and just to conclude, maybe I think this is interesting because it's something that I say often. You know, I think both our works are critical. They have a kind of critical dimension, but it's not a criticality where you take distance and you say, I can criticize this object, which is the academic mode. It's more like, how can I be critical in a proximity? It's not a critical distance, but a critical proximity. You are in the process and you are a player there as well. And because of this, you are under different sort of risks and threats of, you know, where you are, you know, your photo being taken or how the things operate. So I like this idea that, you know, it's something that does something in the world. It's not something critical, just reflecting on something, but it has an agency, right? And every time you have an agency in something, you are, you know, part of a force field, a political field anyway. So you need to understand and how you're going to you know, navigate.
The first time I did a workshop, a genetic engineering workshop organized by Symbiotica, the art science lab in Australia. And I rang my mum at the end of the first day and I was like, I put jellyfish genes into an E. coli and made it glow. And she was like, why did you do that? And I said to her, well, so I knew what it was like to do genetic engineering and that I'm implicated in the project of it. It's like I can't say I'm against genetic engineering because I've done it. And she was like, can't you just think about it? And I was like, well, no, that's what we were being taught, was that to become implicated. And then it's much harder then you've got to think much harder about how you take a critical position, because it was really exciting and amazing to do this thing.
Any more questions or comments? Or are there any in the chat? There aren't any in the chat, okay.
But I don't want, if somebody of you have, okay, no. So I go on. Paolo, this is a question for you, because what we didn't talk about so far is your work on non-human rights. And I find this also a very interesting topic, because when we talk about coexistence or living together, we also have to talk about the domain of jurisdiction, right? So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about this work, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't show it today because otherwise it's too much, and I thought it was more interesting also in relation to Daisy's work, show some more technological, you know, things, how this data processing and can be used as advocacy. No Human Rights is a project I did very early on. I was very much interested in what was happening, what we call the constitutional revolutions. We can call the constitutional revolutions in Latin America, more specifically in Bolivia and Ecuador, in the early 2000s. And yeah, and one of the sort of main things of this, you know, transformation of the societies when the constitution of the country was being changed was that nature was being acknowledged as a subject of rights. and you know, this was somehow an influence of indigenous politics, indigenous philosophy, indigenous cosmologies, to whom nature can never be defined only as an object, because it has agency, it has life, right? It's a being, you know. And it was interesting to see how, you know, instruments of Western thought, like law, positive law, were somehow being appropriated and reframed by the insertion of these different ways of seeing nature and being codified into a new constitutionality that considers that, you know, jaguars and rivers and mountains and, you know, and birds, they are peoples, they are citizens in this, you know, polis that has this constitutionality, right? In that sense, you know, I speak of a constitution almost as Latour would say in his book, We'll Never Be Modern. He speaks of a modernist constitution. So this was a different constitution, definitely not a modernist one, in which, you know, culture and nature are not different entities, they are somehow intertwined. And it's interesting to see that the philosopher, French philosopher Michel Serres, in the aftermath of the Cold War in 1990, he wrote a book called The Rights of Nature. I don't remember if it's The Rights of Nature, something like that. I think it's The Rights of Nature. It was a very important book for me, but I don't remember the title now. And he's going to say, you know, the war that we are living, it's not the war East against West, it's the war of the humans against the world. So we needed to draft a new constitution. We need to draft new rights so nature can be protected. And I think this idea is fascinating. It's fascinating also in relation to your project, that an infrastructure of care is also a legal infrastructure. No, that's why, you know, we have laws, because they are related to care and protection. So that's what I mean, you know, how can we think care, not in a sense of, you know, not in a sort of only maternal or paternal way in terms of, you know, love and affection and things like that, but what's the materiality that we need to create so we can care for things? And I think, you know,
I mean, the legal aspect is incredibly interesting, I think, in relation to so many of these things, because a lot of what we're dealing with is different modes of like intellectual property or ownership of plants, knowledge, care. But the legal, I mean, the amount of time I spend on contracts on this pollinator project, it's entire, the whole thing has to be contractually arranged. And I start to see the design of contracts as an artistic practice in itself, because it defines the nature of what can and can't be done and how it's done. And the process has to be contractually written. So, yeah. Don't become an artist unless
we need as Serres is saying, he said, we need a natural contract. It's called, I think the book's called Natural Contract. No, we, you know, the sort of liberties and you know, and democracy, all the values of, you know, traditional liberalism is a kind of social contract, right? We establish the social contract. That's what doesn't allow you to be subjected to a certain type of violence, you know, in front of the king, in front of the state, or in front of the church, something like that, right? That's kind of the basic rights is what protects you not to suffer violence. So what would be a natural contract? I think that's absolutely a central question to, you know, this notion of care. No.
I think it's so fascinating. So the idea of, I wrote this thing for the Serpentine, did this wonderful book, which I've now forgotten. It's got an orange cover. God, it's really tired. The orange cover, it's their new Back to Earth anthology of artists.
I saw it, yes.
I can see it in my head, but I can't remember the title. It's like a set of instructions by artists about the environment. I did one where you put a quadrat, which is a biodiversity monitoring square, on the ground. You draw a square and you've got to try and identify all the organisms in the square. And you just think of yourself, you're in that square, but you're one thing and there's like a million other things. And suddenly your relationship to all of those things becomes super evident if you're counting by numbers. There's one of you and there might be 5 earthworms and 1 billion bacteria, and you're very much outnumbered. Yeah. So that thinking about that relationship, what's your contractual relationship within that whole network?
Absolutely. That's beautiful way of putting it. Absolutely.
So I haven't done it yet.
But it's interesting, yeah. It's like, yeah, you know, the idea of an interspecies social contract.
Yeah.
You know, what would that be?
Yeah. Can someone in the room do that, please?
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask, what was your experience with the step of giving people agency? Like, how do you, what was your experience? What is effective, or what is better, or what is worse when trying to give people, yeah, hope, or like showing them what they can actually do in their lives?
Maybe I can start. I don't know. I think how I see it, at least my advocacy work. You know, how one situates yourself, things like that. It's kind of outside the frame of an ethnography. It's outside the frame of, you know, a sort of NGO type of activity where you go and you think, you know, you can, let's say, somehow, you know, help people. This idea of help, this idea of development, this idea of, you know, maybe this idea of betterment in a certain way, right? And it's more like, you know, how can I be an ally to those people with whom I'm working? And what's me, from the privileged position I have of having the knowledge and the tools to operate in this very complex world, you know, how can I ally myself beside to, you know, next to, and use, you know, my knowledge and in my networks to, you know, to collaborate with the, you know, with those communities and with the political struggles that they have. So I think it's you know, it's never so much like something that, you know, you come and you go to deliver something and this is going to make, like, you know, that's the idea of technology. You come and you put a smartphone and, you know, you make life better or something like that. I don't think there is this idea of, you know, it's more like more horizontal in a certain way, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way I see it.
I mean, I have so much respect for your practice because it feels like you're doing the much, like I'm operating now this work like within the nice gardeners of England, like that's the community I'm gate crashing.
Great, yeah.
Taste convention. So I like, it's hard for me to not feel inadequate, but I don't know yet is my answer to that question, because it's the first time I've done this. So 10 days time, the experiment, we will see how people respond to this kind of call to action, and whether it's just to the user testing I've done with some, including a garden I volunteer at run by a charity, and they're all pensioners in their 70s, very white, ranging from a former prison guard to, you know, a special needs teacher, and for them it's like, why can't I design the garden? It's like, it's not fit. And then Ken, the prison officer, was like, Pat, it's not for us, it's for the bees. And you're like, oh, they get it. And so to give someone who would never have thought about it in this way, that tool to was really magic for me. But.
Okay. I think we have to end now. Thank you very, very much for sharing your works and your thought with us on this topic. This was really marvelous. Thank you very much. And yeah, and thanks for being here, and join us.
Next time we will hear the bell ourselves through our bodies.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much. Thank you, Daisy.
Thank you. It's really a pity that we can't continue our conversation over a beer or a meal or whatever. So it's always hard to stop after such an intense time together. Yeah. But okay, but so it is. So thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.